My name is Phil, one of the pastors here at Hope City. Last week, Ed got us started with our Lent and Easter sermon series on contemplative Christian spirituality. I want to go back to that just for a moment. I want to ask why contemplative Christian spirituality, not a topic that we often come across when it comes to Lent. But it really has to do with our vision for 2024. Anyone remember what that word is that we're trying to live into? Anyone? No one? So I'm glad we're talking about it. It's contemplation, right? Because as a church, we really want to help us, you, me, slow down and experience God. Often we are moving so fast. We have so much going on that we miss God entirely. Grace and I have weeks like this where we spend our mornings madly trying to get the kids fed, lunches made, the appropriate clothing. So, if it's cold outside, they're wearing their jackets, not wearing shorts to school. And the entire day, the entire morning is a mad rush. And then Grace is working more now too. So she's, off at the school with the kids. I'm at home with the dog. I have lots of time with the dog, lots of conversation, quality time with the dog. And she sees herself as my supervisor, right? That's the relationship that we have. That's how it works when you work from home with a pet. But when the kids get home, when Grace gets home, we have about 15 to 20 minutes during the day. We sit in the kitchen table or at the kitchen, not at a kitchen table, at like a kid's art and craft table designed for our youngest. So it's for, a 6-year-old. And we all sit on at this tiny table in these tiny plastic chairs. I don't know why we do this, but now I do know why my back hurts so much. But we do this and we have 15 to 20 minutes where we share snacks together. We kind of catch up on the day. And then by the time it's like 3:30, 4 o'clock, we're off in different directions again. There's different activities. Grace is taking the girls to dance. I'm taking Micah to soccer or something like that. We might have dinner. I don't know if this sounds familiar to you, like in shifts, right? So there's food on the table. Someone gets to eat it hot. Not all of us get to eat it as it was prepared. Some of us will microwave it later on when we're finally home. And then what Grace and I find is all of a sudden it's 10 o'clock. The kids are finally in bed, and we have a couple moments to ourselves, but we're just exhausted. I don't know if we have time, energy to catch up on the day. And I wonder if this is true for marriage, if this is true for family sometimes, how much more so our relationship with God? Are we moving too fast? Do we have so much going on? Are we constantly in motion that we miss him completely? And so this series is designed to remind us, to remind myself, to remind us as a church to slow down, to make time, space, to incorporate practices that help us experience God. And so I just want to quickly define what contemplative Christian spirituality actually is. We use this word contemplative. I don't know what you think of when you hear that word. Some of us think that to contemplate something is to think deeply about something. And yes, there's aspects to that too. But to contemplate or contemplation is, when it comes to spirituality, it means a practice of deep, silent prayer. It has to do with religious meditation. We're talking about stuff that is more mystical. And so I want to just say right off the bat that the contemplative life, it may sound like it's Zen, it may sound Buddhist, it may sound New Age, but the contemplative life, when it comes to spirituality, is actually rooted in Christian tradition. The early church fathers, the desert fathers, and actually Jesus himself practiced these contemplative spiritual ways of living. He would go to these solitary places to pray. The second thing I want to talk about is how these are contemplative practices, but these are Christian practices in the sense that we're not practicing meditation or silent prayer in order to just empty your minds or relax our bodies, although that may happen as a result, as a side effect, and that would be wonderful. The purpose is to actually encounter the very presence of the Triune God. So we are engaging in meditation, we are engaging in silent prayer, we are engaging in solitude, which is what we're talking about today, for the purpose of encountering the presence of the Triune God. That's the purpose. It's not to empty ourselves, not just to relax our bodies, not just to have our minds clear so that we're able to tackle the day more. The purpose is for relationship and connection with the Triune God. And finally, the last word in this phrase that we're going to talk about over and over during Lent, spirituality. It tells us that the pathway to encounter God is by actually going within our souls. He is there already. He lives within us. The Spirit resides within. And so in order to encounter him, we need to get in touch with our souls. That the way that we encounter God is not just through our mind in terms of learning concepts about God, or not just through our bodies in which we serve God. That is true as well. But strangely, sometimes we neglect our souls. We neglect the truest part of us, the eternal part of us. And so these practices that we're going to talk about during the season of Lent, it's simply practices and a pathway to our souls so that we can meet God where he is already at, right here with us. All right, so that's contemplative Christian spirituality. I also want to address what it's not, okay, in the sense that I know some of us think this is just because, Phil, you're an introvert and you don't like people. No, I like people. I just don't like parties. There's a difference, okay? I'm introverted, but this practice, these things are not just for introverts. Contemplative Christian spirituality, practices like silence and solitude, can sound like an introvert's dream, all right? How many of you during the pandemic, when it was time to isolate and you had to shrink down those bubbles, people that you can connect with, you're like, oh, I could do this, right? Like if they were to send me to, the International Space Station, like I could do that stuff. I don't need to do psychological testing. I'm built for that, right? Some of us here, resonate with that. I only need 2 or 3, 4 people in my life, my family, and maybe one more, right? And we're good. But here's the thing. Contemplative Christian spirituality is not just an introvert's dream. And I guess the other aspect of that would be, is this an extrovert's nightmare? Right? Are we talking about things that make the skin crawl for extroverts, right? For example, I've been talking about a silent retreat with Grace for years. I've done some of these. And every time I bring this up, she's like, why? Why would you torture me like that? Right? I can't stop talking to you. Why would I stop talking? Why would we go somewhere together and stop talking to one another, right? But here's the thing. She is slowly coming around. So I don't think this has to do with personality. I really think this has to do with a concept that Ed brought up last week. He talked about spiritual geography. That contemplative Christian spirituality, learning these practices, isn't based on personality. It's based on spiritual geography. It's based on where your spiritual journey, my spiritual journey, will inevitably take you. There are mountaintops and there are valleys. There are rivers, an oasis, and also desert. And he talked about these deserts as these transitional places where we enter into, where God is going to transform us for the next stage of the journey. And I think those deserts, those wilderness places are there for us whether we are introverts or not. And in those times, silence and solitude, that's what we enter into. That's what we're called to. All right? So contemplative Christian spirituality, again, not based on your personality, my personality, it's based on spiritual geography. And I want to just maybe, warn is too heavy a word, but I want to just let you know that the way that you've connected with God in your teens or in your 20s or in your 30s is going to be different than how you connect with God in your 40s and 50s and 60s. Ed talked about this last week, and I wish someone told me that when I was in my 20s, because I thought all I needed to experience God and have relationship with him, be inspired by his presence, was just to do the things that I've always done and maybe just turn up the volume more. Just more of that, more of what worked in the past. But that's not the way life works. That's not the way God works. He is going to lead us deeper into relationship with him. And so this is just a heads up that for those of us, especially those of us who are in the younger set, demographic of our church, the wilderness is ahead. But the wilderness is a good place. It's a place where we are prepared for the rest of our journey in a meaningful way, in a way that matures us. I wish someone gave me a heads up on this when I was growing up in the church. That spiritual geography is real. Mountaintops are absolutely real. Valleys are real. But the desert is real too. Desert can be a good place if we allow God to do what he wants to do. So for our series, we are exploring different contemplative spiritual practices. Today, we're going to talk about solitude. Next week, we're talking about silence. Week after that, we're talking about Lectio Divina. This is a practice of reading the word not for information about God, but for encounter with God. And then we're going to talk about Sabbath. We're bringing someone in, Jessica Chan, on Good Friday to teach us what lament looks like. Wow, we know how to sing praise to God, but did you know so many of the Psalms are Psalms of lament? We don't know how to deal with the stuff and with the pain of our lives. What would our lives look like if we were to be able to find practices that allow us to encounter God in our disappointment and in our pain? So that's what we're going to do. But we won't end there because we are Easter people. And on Easter Sunday, we land on joy, practices of joy. Okay? That's where we're going. For the next two sermons, we're going to camp around the same passage. This is 1 Kings 19, 1-19. I'm going to cover the first half of it today, but I wanted you guys to experience and hear the story as a whole so that later on you can see the pieces come together, okay? So this is how 1 Kings 19, verses 1-19 reads. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, read desert. He came to a broom bush, sat under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up, ate, and drank. Strengthened by the food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper. Then when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king of Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. So as I said, this is the text of Scripture that we will be exploring as we unpack solitude and silence over the next 2 weeks. Solitude, if we are looking for an image that will symbolize this theme that we're diving into, solitude is really symbolized by this broom tree, this broom bush that Elijah falls asleep under. And then silence, if you're kind of looking at the week ahead and what to focus on, what symbolizes silence is this gentle whisper that Elijah hears, and he knows that the presence of God is found there. Solitude, though, is at the heart of contemplative Christian spirituality. Henry Nouwen says it like this: without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and listen to him. And so I do want to ask, what drives us to solitude? What drives us to silence? And over again, I found that it's not so much lofty and pure goals like wanting to seek God's presence. None of us run to solitude and silence on our own. Actually, we usually enter into solitude by way of desperation. When we find that things in our lives are not working out and we've tried. That there's things that need fixing, but we don't know how to fix it. We have tried. That we have longings that we have searched to meet and tried to find different ways to meet. And these longings are still unmet. I mean, look at Elijah here. How does Elijah go from the victory and the high that we see in chapter 18 to this rock bottom in chapter 19, where he sits down under this broom tree and he prays to God that he might die. How does he go from that? That always troubled me and puzzled me. And I actually looked down on Elijah because I was like, you just had the greatest victory of your prophetic career. The queen says something to you. How do you spin out just because of a threat from the queen? You just took out all the prophets of Baal. A bit of background here. Chapter 18, Elijah, following God's command, he challenges the prophets of Baal to a showdown to prove whether Baal is God or Yahweh is God. And he does this because King Ahab and Queen Jezebel of Israel have actually led all the people of Israel to abandon Yahweh and embrace Baal as God instead. In response, Yahweh has stopped the sky from producing rain. This creates a drought resulting in this devastating famine. People are not eating for months. People are not eating for years. Ahab and Jezebel believe that Elijah is responsible because he keeps agitating against Baal. They call him a troublemaker. Stop messing with the true God who's in charge, Elijah. Leave Baal alone and we'll finally get rain. You are the cause of all of this trouble for us and for Israel. Obviously, Elijah believes otherwise, so he proposes a showdown. He tells Ahab to gather all the people of Israel to meet him on Mount Carmel, which is the stronghold of Baal. He's willing to meet the prophets of Baal on their turf, where they are strongest, on their holy mountain. He tells Ahab to gather all the prophets of Baal, over 450, and then the 400 prophets of Asherah as well. I don't have time to go into how Asherah and Baal interact, but it's not PG, okay? It's stuff that I will not describe here right now. But the showdown consisted of each setting up an altar. The prophets of Baal, the prophets of Asherah setting up an altar, setting up the wood, preparing a bull on the altar as a sacrifice. But they will not set fire to it. Instead, the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah will call on the name of their gods. And then Elijah here, with his altar, his wood, his sacrifice, will call on the name of Yahweh. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. That's the showdown. That's the proposal. That's the contest. And everyone agrees to this. The prophets of Baal and Asherah agreed to this. Ahab agrees to this. The people of Israel agreed to this. Once and for all, there's a referendum. Who's really in charge? Long story short, the prophets of Baal and Asherah start building their altar in the morning, and by noon, they have been calling out to their gods to set the sacrifice on fire to no avail. Okay, so they built this altar at sunrise. They've been calling out all day. It's noontime now. Elijah still hasn't built anything on this side at all whatsoever. Instead, he goes over to them, he taunts them a little bit, and he says, hey, you guys aren't loud enough, so they shout louder. And then he goes over later on, past noon, and he's like, clearly, the gods must be asleep. You need to do more to get their attention. And so the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah start cutting themselves in order to get their God's attention. Surely this will get their attention. At the end of the day, as sun begins to set, Elijah begins building the altar that was for Yahweh that was destroyed. He rebuilds that, arranges the wood, sets the bull on it, and then he goes and he asks the people to pour water over it 3 times so that it is soaked through, so that there's a trench around this altar that he's built, and it's now filled with water. At evening, he steps forward, he prays, and this is simply what he says: Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are the God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And Scripture tells us that fire from the Lord fell from the sky, burned up the sacrifice, burned up the wood, burned up the stones, burned up the soil, evaporated all of the water from the trench. And all of the people saw this. They fell down in worship, and they cried, "The Lord, Yahweh, He is God." Then Elijah commanded all the people to seize the prophets of Baal and had them all slaughtered. And then shortly after this, the clouds begin to form in the sky. There is rain, the end of the drought, the end of the famine. This is an incredible victory. So how does he go from this victory, this high, to the low where he is underneath the broom tree asking God to take his life? How does that happen? I think in my youth, I never understood why Elijah could go from such a high to such a low. Because I thought if he had experienced so much from God, God's power, God being with him, shouldn't he go and just take on Jezebel and take on Ahab? That would be the next thing to do. You go from high to high in your life with God. I'm older now. I've experienced a little bit more in life. And now I somehow understand a little bit more. Elijah just performed the greatest miracle of his prophetic career. There are no greater heights when it comes to being a prophet. There are no greater victories. And I wonder if sometimes life can be like that for us as well, that it's not just in our failures where we know something is missing, but it's just in our failures something is missing, and it's obvious that something is missing. It's very clear. But somehow in the moments of great success in our lives, we can actually come to the end of ourselves. When we have achieved everything we've ever wanted, everything that we've ever chased, and still in that feel empty, still feel alone, still feel like we haven't done anything to move the needle at all when it comes to the universe. We thought we would have great impact, and it was all for nothing. And we realized this is the best and all that I can give, and still it's for nothing. I think that's what Elijah is wrestling with after this great victory. Immediately after this victorious triumph over the prophets of Baal, Jezebel sends him this message, a message that's meant to intimidate him and discourage him and discredit him. If she wanted to kill him, she would not have sent a messenger. She would have sent an assassin, and he would have been dead. But she sent a messenger to mess with him psychologically, and it worked. She is telling him, I don't care what happened at Mount Carmel. I am still the queen. She tells him that his greatest victory in his prophetic career has not changed her heart or her mind one bit. Religious policy in Israel is still the same. We worship Baal and Asherah. That was a great circus performance. Good for you, Elijah. It does nothing in the real world. That's what she's saying to him. Can you imagine how utterly useless Elijah must have felt in that moment? What else can you do as a prophet of the living God? Is there more? How can there be more? And even if he does more, will it make a difference for these people, this king, this queen? Jezebel's threat sends him over the edge into fear, into depression, into discouragement, and he runs. He runs for his life. In desperation, he withdraws from his servant. He walks into the wilderness alone. In desperation, he collapses under this solitary broom tree. In desperation, he is so discouraged that he tells God that you might as well take my life. I am no better than any of those before me. Like, I thought I was special. I thought I could make a difference. I thought I would have an impact on the religious life of your people. But it is as if I've never existed in the first place, so erase me. We enter into solitude by way of desperation. And I tell you this because I don't want you to be blindsided when one day you feel desperate in your life. Because it happens, and it will happen to us if we have the privilege of living long enough. Life will happen to us. We will get discouraged. We will withdraw. We will collapse. But God meets us in that. We enter into solitude by way of desperation. But desperation is a really good thing when it comes to the spiritual life, because desperation opens us up to answers and to solutions we would not have found on our own. It makes us willing to take on risk in order to find what we're looking for, or maybe even to admit, I thought my whole life I knew what I was looking for and living for. But it must be something else. God must be something more. Desperation drives us to seek things out with an all-consuming intensity, as if our lives depended on it. And desperation allows us to finally be aware of our limits. Oh my goodness. That we don't have it all within ourselves. That we truly need God. Elijah's willingness to enter into solitude makes space for God to minister to him in ways that he had not yet experienced. It is in solitude and silence that he has this opportunity to face himself, to give up control for his own journey, his own life, his own ministry, and then to experience God's transforming presence. Something happens to him at the broom tree. Something happens to him in that cave that would not have happened to him outside of solitude, outside of silence, outside of being driven there because of desperation. The invitation for us is in those moments. It's to find our place, my place, your place, underneath the solitary broom tree, in the wilderness of our own doubts, of our questions, and all of our unfulfilled longings. The invitation is to find ourselves under our broom tree. What does God do for us in the solitude of that broom tree? I believe that in solitude, we experience God as our refuge. I mean, we sing about this all the time. We talk about it all the time. But there's something about solitude that makes us truly vulnerable, where we are truly at the end of ourselves, where we begin to not just talk about God and talk about him as a concept where he is our refuge and our shelter, but we truly experience this. Most of us here living in the Pacific Northwest are unfamiliar with desert environments. I'm used to hiking here in Vancouver. I love the Seymour demonstration forest. Even during the heat dome, our evergreen trees provide this amazing shade. It's actually cool underneath that canopy. But the desert is something else. There's not many trees around. There's no shade. It's really hot and dry and dusty. Last summer, my family and I, we went to Lake Tahoe, and we experienced what it was like to hike in the desert. And believe me, you don't hike in the afternoon. You hike early in the morning before it gets too hot. You will not survive. You will not make it out there. The desert's something else. Really hot, really dry, really dusty. But from time to time in the Middle East, you will find single solitary broom bushes, broom trees. And these broom trees are sometimes called juniper in the scriptures. And they're all referring to the same flowering desert plant. It can grow up to 8 feet, sometimes even 12 feet in height. And together with this height, you can kind of see the shape of this broom bush, this broom tree. This abundance of these leaves, it makes it an excellent source of shade in the hot Middle Eastern sun. Looking at this here, I can say, yeah, I would take a nap there too, right? Like, if you were tired, you could take a nap there for sure, especially if that was the only shade. And so that's why the Bible usually associates these broom trees with shelter and with rest. You see, in solitude, we experience God as our refuge, God as our shelter, God as our rest. What does it mean to talk about God as our shelter? Not just from the sun and the heat, but I think from the chaos of our lives. Shelter from crushing disappointment. Shelter from unfulfilled hopes and unfulfilled dreams. In solitude, we experience God as our refuge and as our shelter in ways that we haven't before. Because in solitude, we enter into a state of vulnerability that we usually avoid. Henry Nouwen says this about solitude and vulnerability. In solitude, I get rid of my scaffolding. No friends to talk with. No telephone calls to make. I inserted this, text and social media. No meetings to attend, no music to entertain, no books to distract. I also inserted shows to stream. But I'm not talking about you, I'm just talking about me, okay? No, just me. In solitude, we enter into relating with God naked, vulnerable, weak, sinful, deprived, broken, as nothing. It is this nothingness that I have to face in my solitude, a nothingness so dreadful that everything in me wants to run to my friends, my work, my distractions, so that I can forget my nothingness and make myself believe that I am worth something. We have all of these things that we depend on outside of God for our worth, for our feeling of security, for a feeling of protection. And we rarely want to truly admit how vulnerable we are. But it's in the stripping away of self that comes with solitude, where God shelters us, where God is our refuge, where he has always been our shelter, always been our refuge. But it's in that solitude that we finally can see that he shelters, he's the refuge, and he's the one that truly matters in that. God is our shelter. God is our rest. Elijah here in this passage, in his exhaustion, he falls asleep not just once, but twice. He is physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually exhausted. He is completely spent. And what does God do? He doesn't begin speaking to him. He doesn't begin teaching him. He doesn't begin correcting him. He just lets Elijah sleep twice, as much as he needs, as much as he wants. Actually, the angel wakes him up, but wakes him up to eat and drink so that he can sleep more, because it's hard to sleep on an empty stomach. So maybe rest is what you and I so desperately need. But no one has ever given you permission to take a break, to rest, to attend to your soul. If this is you, the invitation of the broom tree is for you, to take your place under it, to receive rest from God that you need, shelter and refuge from God that you need. And then under the broom tree in solitude, we also experience God's restoration. Specifically, we experience God providing for us in ways we cannot provide for ourselves. Elijah had no one with him in this journey. He had nothing with him. He did not bring food with him. He did not bring water, right? Like, you and I know not to go hiking in the North Shore Mountains without food and water, right? Everyone nod, right? Because we do not want to involve North Shore search and rescue. He goes out totally unprepared, no provisions, because he literally went out into the desert in order to die. He falls asleep. The angel wakes him up and tells him to eat. There's bread that's freshly baked over hot coals and a pitcher of water. One of my favorite restaurants in the entire city of Vancouver, Greater Vancouver, is in New West, and it's called Wild Thyme. It's a Lebanese restaurant. They make fresh pita in this oven, and I'm going to tell you, don't order the lamb. Their flatbreads are good, but it's all about the pita that they make. It's this fluffy pillow where it's crispy and crunchy on the outside and soft and just amazing on the inside, right? Amazing, amazing, amazing. This is what God provides Elijah with. It could have been just some stale crackers, right? If this was about sustenance. But it's about hospitality in this moment. And this reminds me, this whole hot bread baked over hot coals. It reminds me of the Israelites' manna in the desert. Elijah's water in a pitcher in the middle of the desert reminds me of God giving the Israelites water streaming out of a rock. God nourishes us. And it shouldn't surprise us because God has been providing for his people in the desert ever since the very beginning. He nourishes us, he restores our strength, and then, only then, does God speak to us. After he has nourished us, after he has strengthened us, after he has sheltered us, after he has been our refuge, he says, "Get up and eat. For the journey is too much for you." The journey is too much for you. The translation here is, you are not going to die. Your journey is not over, not yet. But the journey is too much for you. You need to eat and drink because you cannot make it on your own. You cannot make it on your own strength. God is saying to us, and this is what happens to us in solitude and silence, this next stage in your life, this next stage, this next part of your journey will be too much for you unless you let me shelter you, unless you let me give you rest, unless you let me nourish you, so that you can live this next chapter of your life, a wonderful chapter, not by your own strength. Oh, you've seen that, and it goes nowhere. But this next part of your journey lived by my strength. You don't have to make it on your own. I wonder what our lives would look like here and now, or maybe in the future when you come to places of desperation, where you and I engage the very heart of God and let him minister to us in this way, where he will be your shelter, he will give you rest, and he will restore your strength, that you may know him as one who does so lovingly. I wonder what that will look like for us if we live this way. I want to talk about the fruit of solitude right now. What happens when we spend time with God, when we withdraw from others, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable before him, when we experience him as shelter, experience him as the refuge and as the restoration of our lives. I think the fruit of solitude is not that we will become less social or antisocial or isolated from other human beings. There's a tendency to think this because we kind of know what hermits usually do. Hermits get off grid, build a hut away from everyone else, and they don't want to have interactions with other human beings. Like that's why they built the hut out there. But I want to explain here that the fruit of solitude is not more isolation. It might mean more times where you seek out times of solitude and silence. But the fruit of solitude and silence is actually compassion. We experience God's compassion for us as he ministers to us as our refuge, as our restoration. And in his empathy, he forms in us compassion for ourselves and a deep compassion for others. Henry Nouwen says this. He says, in and through solitude, we do not move away from people. It's not like, man, I've experienced so much of God here. I don't need all of you suckers, right? You guys make my life more complicated, more difficult. I'm just going to go spend more time with God in solitude and silence. It's not like this. He says, in and through solitude, we do not move away from people. On the contrary, we move closer to them through compassion. For me, this doesn't mean that if I spend time in solitude, I will like to go to big parties, right? That's still torture for me. But it means that when I spend time in solitude with God, I have a deeper capacity to connect with people and truly empathize and truly love in a way that I know is not because of who I am. It's because of some transforming work that God is doing as I'm spending time with him in solitude and silence. He helps us have more genuine, authentic, compassionate relationships with others when we withdraw and spend time with him. We return from solitude with the ability to draw close to others and actually closer to ourselves as well. Solitude doesn't further isolate us. It actually frees us to a deeper and more compassionate connection with those whom God has placed around us. Okay, so that's solitude. Next week, we're going to talk about the practice of silence. Andrew and I have talked about what we want to accomplish through this series. And part of what we wanted to experiment with you, which time allows for today, is to begin practicing this here, right now. To give you guys time and space where I can lead you guys through a few minutes of a practice of solitude. Right? So if you're willing to try this, and so far, Hope City, you guys have been really, really good with all that we experiment with, right? Some things that definitely do not work, and some things that once in a while actually work. But we're going to try this. That's what we do as a church. I want to invite you to just settle into a comfortable position. You may want to spread out if you want. I see a whole bunch of seats over here. If you want to sit on a bench over there, if you really want solitude, away from others, You can try to experiment with that even in this space. But settle into a comfortable physical position. I want to invite you to take 3 deep breaths where you can inhale deeply and exhale slowly. Now as you breathe, now as you become quiet, I invite you to allow that which is usually unknown, maybe even unnamed within you, just to gently surface. I want to invite you to notice just the dynamics that are drawing you deeper into solitude at this time in your life. What is happening inside you and in your relationship with God right now that seems to be inviting you into solitude, to take your place underneath that broom tree? Do the words desperation or desire capture what you are experiencing? Or is there another word or phrase that more accurately expresses what's going on inside of you? I want to invite you to allow these inner experiences and dynamics to just come to the surface. Invite you to feel them, name them if you're able, but just to sit with them. Express them to God if you wish. All we want to do today is just to begin creating a space for yourself and for those things that are really stirring in the inside of your soul. Invite you to listen to them not as experiences to be avoided, but just as invitations to open yourself to God in new ways. Father God, we come before you and we simply ask that you would meet us in our desperation. Meet us as we seek you. Meet us as we come to our own broom tree. whether it's to rest, to be nourished and strengthened by you again, or to experience you as our shelter. I ask for each one of us here that you would encounter us as we seek you in solitude. Amen.